Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my playoff rankings for the wild card weekend going into the first week of the 2020 NFL playoffs. So, many of you may be wondering, Andrew, why do you have rankings for this coming week? Well, I know there are many people out there that do play fantasy football, whether it's DFS or even in their home leagues, in a fantasy football sense for the playoffs. They draft players, they play players, but mainly I want to go ahead and do my rankings to kind of give you guys perspective on who I think is going to have the best week going into week 18 technically, so that if you are going to be playing some DFS this weekend, you can go ahead and get a little bit of my perspective. So before we begin, let me go out ahead and tell you guys Happy New Year's. Welcome to 2020. It's going to be a fantastic year. Thank you everybody who's made 2019, 2018 the 2 years that I spent on this channel that much better, so I do appreciate that. Before we begin, let me remind all of you, if you have not yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. Also, click the bell notification button to stay up to date on my latest content, and don't forget to click the like button if you like today's video. Thank you very much. Hey everybody, how's everybody doing? Okay, so really quickly, just to kind of give you guys some perspective. So earlier this week, I dropped a podcast with my brother and one of my best friends, Davo. We talk fantasy, we talk NFL. The entire episode was the first time that I'd done anything outside of this room, pretty much, right? So it was a little bit out of my comfort zone. I had multiple microphones, and it was a learning process, to say the least. So if you haven't already checked that out, we talk about the NFL breakdowns in terms of all 12 teams that made the playoffs, our playoff predictions, and then we also talk about some dark horse teams that you should be on the lookout for going into the 2019-2020 NFL playoffs. So if you want to go ahead and check that out. Other than that, we'll have another episode tomorrow talking about wild card weekend, the matchups at hand, and who we think pretty much fits in the best lineup that you can build in a DFS this weekend. So we'll talk about that. We'll go over that, and I think it's either tomorrow or Friday we'll record it. But either way, should be fun. Outside of that, let's talk about some rankings going into this week and who I think, in my opinion, is going to be the best players at each position: running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, going into the week. So starting off with my running back rankings, we have top 16 rankings at the position. We're going to start off with Derrick Henry as my number one, but that doesn't really bring up much of a, I don't think it should be much of a surprise to many of you. To be honest, Derrick Henry had a monster week 17, ran the ball 32 times. It's very apparent that this team is a run-first team, and they very much so have bought into Derrick Henry this season, and I don't think anybody can really stop them. Every team shows up every Sunday, Thursday, or Monday whenever they play against the Tennessee Titans with the one goal of trying to stop Derrick Henry, and that has become an extremely difficult task for every team, as he's the rushing leader or rushing title winner of 2019. The thing is, it's not, too many weeks ago where we saw the New England Patriots give up 156 yards total to Joe Mixon, 136 on the ground alone. There are times in which the New England Patriots have struggled defensively. This is a run-heavy team, and they're going to shove it down the Patriots' throats this week. And I think Derrick Henry, in my opinion, will probably finish as the number one back at the end of the wild card weekend. Moving on as my number two, Alvin Kamara. Not really much of a surprise. The guy's finally caught some momentum in the last couple of weeks, has scored 4 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks, and is progressively getting to the point where we expect to see Alvin Kamara play. Going into this coming week, playing against the Minnesota Vikings, this is a defense that at times has been extremely stout. I mean, overall, this is a defense that when you think of the Minnesota Vikings defense, you think, oh, these guys can stop the run. And that was the case for majority of the season. But as of late, they've really fallen apart. I mean, truly have fallen apart. Just this last couple of weeks, obviously this past week, week 17, David Montgomery had the best game of his season, in my opinion. 113 yards on the ground on 23 carries. The week before that, when the number one defense was out there trying to win a game, Aaron Jones ran for 154 and 2 touchdowns. A couple weeks before that, we had Chris Carson go for 100. Rashad Penny in that same game go for 74 and 33 through the air, 2 touchdowns for him. And, even Damian Williams in that week against the Minnesota Vikings, when Matt Moore was the starting quarterback, he had a pretty good game. There are times here that we've seen the Minnesota Vikings defense kind of fall apart in terms of stopping the run. And I think Alvin Kamara could be up to task at this week. He's my number 2. Moving on to number 3, Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook practiced fully today. This is the first time in about 3 weeks of and a half, 3 weeks that he's practiced fully and he's ready to go this week as the starting running back of the Minnesota Vikings. We saw the Minnesota Vikings struggle without his presence. Obviously, they had a little bit of a boost from Mike Boone last week, but that was a game with no consequence. Whether or not they won or lost, it didn't really matter. So going into Week 18, the wild card weekend, the first round of the playoffs, they will be in hostile territory against the defense that likes to stop the run and is very good at doing so. But it's going to be a test because this team is very good at running the ball when Dalvin Cook is in the backfield. When they're firing on all cylinders, they can be quite the threat. It only takes one lane, and this guy could take it to the house. He's my number 3 running back on the week against the New Orleans Saints. Again, a defense that even if I was to go over the stats, it's pretty apparent that Dalvin Cook is up against a very difficult task this coming week. My number 4 running back on the week is somebody that I've been very high on for the last, for maybe the entire 2019 season. I like Sony Michel, and it's no secret. I've talked about him on a very pretty wide extent. I like Sony Michel. I like his opportunity, and I like how this offense currently looks for his potential in the future. Sony Michel is a running back that is going to be given 18 plus carries a game, and he's going to have to help Tom Brady in this offense really open it up. Without the contributions of Sony Michel, they wouldn't have won a Super Bowl last year. The way that he performed in the wild card, or in the second, third, and fourth round of the playoffs, I mean, he dominated the Chargers defense, the Kansas City Chiefs defense, and then also the Rams defense in the Super Bowl. In the last 3 weeks, the guy has totaled for 89, 96, 74 yards on the ground each of the last 3 games. So that is very, very promising. His total touches in the last 3 games, 19, 21, and 18. They're promising numbers. And against the Tennessee Titans, who in my opinion, this is a defense that is not good enough at stopping the run. Even if we look at what opposing running backs have done in the last couple of weeks, just reading it off the bat, Alvin Kamara a couple weeks back, 80 for 2 touchdowns. Carlos Hyde 104 and 1. We saw ourselves with DeAndre Washington 54 totaled 96 and 1. Leonard Fournette 97 and 2 with 62 yards through the air. We even saw Duke Johnson score last week with very relative, resistance overall from this defense. So I think Sony Michel going into this week, they're going to have to run the ball. Edelman's a little banged up. He should be a good play. Moving on to number 5, Devin Singletary. I think when we talk about who has one of the best matchups this week, it's certainly, without a doubt in my mind, anybody who's playing against that Houston Texans defense. Now, at times, the Houston Texans defense have made plays this year. Sure, they get J.J. Watt back. The statistics are pretty apparent. When J.J. Watt's on the field, they give up 1.5 yard per carry on average to the outside of the tackle. But that all being said, as it currently stands, this is a defense that is bleeding out, and they really cannot stop the run. Obviously, we've mentioned it. Derrick Henry went for 211 yards on 32 carries for 3 touchdowns last week against a team that really wasn't trying hard. But when they were the week before, Ronald Jones went for 77 and 1, broke over 100 total yards, counting the receiving game. Derrick Henry a couple weeks back, 86 yards, and he still got injured and still was able to produce. Phillip Lindsay, 51 and 1 touchdown. James White, 79 yards on the ground, 98 through the air with 2 receiving touchdowns. Jonathan Williams went for 104 and 1. Gus Edwards went for 112 and 1. There are many teams that have dominated this defense, and it will be no surprise, in my opinion, if Devin Singletary and this Bills offense runs right through them. Moving on to number 6, you may be wondering where Miles Sanders is. As it currently stands, Miles Sanders did not participate in practice today, Wednesday, January 1st, and they did bring up a player from the practice squad and sign somebody. So my thought process is probably Boston Scott is going to be the starting running back this week. They might give it a shot with Miles Sanders, but they're going to play it smart. They're not going to force this guy. He's a young, up-and-coming rookie running back that made some pretty big moves this year in his progressions. And as of right now, Boston Scott's a guy that, even from what we saw him do last week, he is making leaps and bounds of progression himself. He had 3 rushing touchdowns, had himself 19 carries on the ground for 54 yards, 4 catches for 84 receiving yards. This is a player that is consistently producing for this offense, and I think he is a very valuable prospect this week for you to maybe pick up and put him in your lineup. Moving on, you pick him up by buying him pretty much with a little anyway, regardless, moving on. Travis Homer is my number 7 at this moment in time. As it currently stands, I think Marshawn Lynch, Travis Homer, who is more likely to be successful? I think it's going to be Homer. Just this past week, he played 61% of the offensive snaps, while Marshawn Lynch played the 30-some-odd% that he did. As it currently stands, Travis Homer had a lot of opportunity in the receiving game, unless they were on the goal line. Marshawn Lynch wasn't really asked to come in the game late in that stretch. If, in fact, we get a down-to-the-wire contest and we have the Seattle Seahawks trying to spread out the offense and attack the Eagles where they are weakest in the secondary, then I expect a lot of Travis Homer to be on the field. Even in the running game, he had a very big contribution. Was averaging a pretty good yard per carry average against the 49ers defense that is no joke. So playing against the Eagles, again, another defense that in terms of stopping the run is good. I do expect Travis Homer to, in the passing game on the ground, get his opportunities and be a pretty big contributor for this offense. Again, he had a 6.2 yard per carry average, 5 receptions for 30 yards on 5 targets on the ground. Pretty good for me. Moving on, again, Marshawn Lynch is my number 8. I think he will get his opportunity, and he probably will fall in the end zone like he did last week. Obviously, his opportunity last week was limited. It was his first game back in God knows how long, and it'll take time. But 12 rushes for 34 yards and a touchdown, that's fine. That is a promising number, and we could potentially see him get more and more of a workload as the weeks progress. That's a promising sign. I think if, in fact, the Seahawks are to get up ahead early, we could see a lot of run-heavy tendencies from the Seahawks in the second half, which is pretty promising for a guy like Marshawn. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about the last 8 running backs that I wanted to rank this week. Again, Miles Sanders is right here. He's probably not going to play. If he does, then we can add him, and probably he'll take Boston Scott's spot, and Boston Scott would sit somewhere in this, probably at the number 9 spot, and we'd rotate everyone down one spot. But anyway, moving on. Let's talk about Carlos Hyde as my number 9 running back. I like Carlos Hyde. He broke over 1,000 yards. He's going to be given the opportunity against the Buffalo Bills. It's probably the best matchup he could have possibly asked for outside of playing against Tennessee once again. Buffalo is a good defense. Overall, in terms of giving up yards on the ground through the air, they've been pretty good this season, to say the least. There have been times in which this defense has given up yards. There was a stint from week 8 through 10 in which I could not trust this defense, and I was playing any running back I could possibly play against them. But in the last couple weeks, they have been far better in terms of not really giving up too much to opposing running backs. What they do lack, in my opinion, is giving up yards to running backs in the receiving game. Now, Carlos Hyde's not going to be the one that takes advantage of that. We'll talk about Duke Johnson in a minute. But I think, again, having the ability to have 15-plus touches on the ground and the goal line work, that gives you inherent value, and that's where Carlos Hyde currently stands. Moving on to number 10, we have James White. Again, I think James White, if in fact we do get ourselves Sony Michel running the ball 18-plus times in this game, Sony, they can move James White around. They're going to use him in the passing game as much as they possibly can. Whether this game is a blowout or it's them coming back in order to win this game, James White is going to have to be used a lot in the passing game. I truly do believe that. With Edelman dealing with that shoulder, back, knee, everything, is bugging him right now in terms of injuries. The next best receiver, N'Keal Harry, James White, these are the guys that need to step up. James White is a guy that Brady has, without a doubt, year after year relied upon, and he's coming, when it matters most. So as of right now, James White, a guy that is always deadly to catch a couple touchdowns near the goal line, and when they're down in the red zone, but also be a pretty big contributor in a PPR sense. As long as they target him and get him in the game more often, it would be good to see James White potentially have himself a pretty good game here. He's my number 10. Moving on to 11, Duke Johnson. Like I mentioned earlier, I think the Buffalo Bills, when they struggle the most, is not really up the middle or on the ground, but it's through the air to a receiving back. If I expect to see this correctly, both teams are going to probably start off slow. We're going to see a tight matchup until the end, and Duke Johnson will probably get more usage than Carlos Hyde, despite having Carlos Hyde higher up, because I do expect him to still use him down in the goal line and potentially get that touchdown. That's where Duke Johnson will kind of take the back seat. Duke Johnson getting a touchdown would be fantastic, but that's total upside, and we're not going to really bank on that potentially happening for him. So we're going to have to rely upon him in the passing game hopefully catching 4 or 5 passes in order to bring his value up. Moving on, Rex Burkhead's my number 12 again. With Sony Michel getting so many carries, there's always a potential of Rex Burkhead coming in on a run-heavy scheme and trying to keep the ball out of Ryan Tannehill's hands in order to just make it easier on the Patriots defense. When you're getting pounded by Derrick Henry for the entirety of the game, it is going to be an extremely tough task to go ahead and survive until the fourth quarter and be able to stop this guy. He is an absolute monster, and he's going to run through your defense. So maybe you have to use every single one of your running backs, Michel, White, and Burkhead this week and at their highest potential in order to make sure that Ryan Tannehill and this Tennessee offense doesn't have as many opportunities as they could potentially have in order to make sure that Tom Brady can get the job done. Moving on, number 13 is Mike Boone. Again, I think Alexander Mattison was a participant in practice today, but the ability of Boone is apparent. I mean, yeah, obviously in Week 16 fantasy championships, he screwed a lot of people, but he definitely has the ability to run the ball. Whether or not he gets the job done is totally up to his opportunity. I think him and Madison could be splitting, but I think they'll probably lean towards Mike Boone if, in fact, Madison isn't 100% full go by the end of the week. So Mike Boone sits at my number 13. Number 14 will be Jordan Howard again. If Miles Sanders right here is to go ahead and miss, Jordan Howard hasn't really played in many weeks, but then he would be given the next upcoming opportunity after Boston Scott. Latavius Murray sits here. Obviously, Latavius Murray continues to get touches in this offense. What he ends up doing with them isn't, too significant. But again, he's in the offense. He will have the opportunity to run the ball or touch the ball about 10 times in a singular game like he typically does. And if, in fact, he does break off one for something, I wouldn't be surprised. But again, we're just limiting it because he is not probably going to do that. He's a bruising back, 3 yards in a cloud of dust, as we typically say. Moving on, the last running back is Frank Gore. Frank Gore still sometimes gets in when the Buffalo Bills are down at the goal line or need a plunge. Frank Gore will step in the game and he will hawk or vulture, quote unquote, a touchdown from Singletary. There's always a possibility of that happening once again this week, and therefore he sits at my number 16. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about wide receivers going into this week, starting off with my number 1, Michael Thomas. Again, Michael Thomas is the best wide receiver in the National Football League, and it is no doubt, no matter who he plays against, especially Xavier Rhodes, who's going to get work this week, he's going to have a fantastic week. I don't even need to have the conversation any longer. Michael Thomas is without a doubt my number 1. Moving on to number 2, we have DeAndre Hopkins. As it currently stands, DeAndre Hopkins, fantastic wide receiver, but he'll have Tre'Davious White all over him. And that is not an easy task at all at hand. As it currently stands, DeAndre Hopkins, one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. And sure, he's almost to the level this season of Michael Thomas, but saying that would be a little bit of a discredit to Michael Thomas. DeAndre Hopkins at times will disappear. It is apparent, and it has happened many times this season, especially against top fleet cornerbacks. And I think, without a doubt, Tre'Davious White is one of those guys. So we could once again potentially see him disappear in this week's matchup. But I do think because of how limited Will Fuller has been, the absence of Kiki Cutie this year, and really Kenny Stills not being able to step up and put together too much of a performance on a weekly basis, very inconsistent, we're going to have to rely upon DeAndre Hopkins. He'll sit as my number 2 this week. Moving on to number 3, DK Metcalf. I think DK Metcalf's opportunity, his target count last week, that is what I like to see. 12 targets, 6 receptions, 81 yards, and a touchdown against a very good secondary overall. Now you get to play against the Eagles. Yeah, the last time they played against the Eagles, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett did not have great weeks, but they're going to go ahead and address that, and they're going to be better this coming week. I think DK Metcalf, as my number 3 wide receiver, isn't much of a surprise to many of you, as he's, he really has become one of the better wide receivers in the National Football League, to say the least, in my opinion. And as long as he'll have this consistent opportunity, which in my opinion he will, and he'll hopefully continue to get. Obviously, 12 targets this season was the most that he'd seen in a singular game, but hopefully they'll continue to rely upon him to that extent in order to help them win games. Moving on, number 4, DK Metcalf had a teammate down at Ole Miss. That was A.J. Brown. Both these wide receivers, rookies, feasting this season. A.J. Brown, another one of these guys that on a consistent basis on the weekly is scoring double-digit fantasy points and sometimes plus 20 points in half-point PPR scoring formats. As it currently stands, the guy in the last 6 weeks of the season has put up 100 yards plus, total in terms of yards from scrimmage in 5 of the last 6 games. He scored a touchdown in 5 out of the last 6 games. Or he has, I think, he has. So overall, let's be honest, A.J. Brown, he's unstoppable at this moment. I think what Devontae Parker did to the secondary of the New England Patriots kind of gives us more hope that A.J. Brown will produce to the level. But again, we have to understand there's nobody else outside of A.J. Brown in this offense to produce. Corey Davis could show up, maybe do something. But again, A.J. Brown is the truth when it comes to this passing offense. And that's what you're going to have to rely upon if, in fact, you're going to buy in on my thoughts that the Tennessee Titans do beat the Patriots this week. He's my number 4. Moving on to number 5, we have John Brown. Again, when we're talking about consistency, when we're talking about a guy that is going to put up 10-plus points every single week, no matter how he does it, whether it's throwing the ball, receiving the ball, or running the ball, he'll get the job done. That's what John Brown has done all season long. There is a reason why he is a wide receiver 2 by the end of the 2019 season, and I think going into 2020, now that we currently see him as the number 1 wide receiver of this Bills offense, he's going to be asked to do a lot of things, especially this week against the Houston Texans secondary, one of the weakest secondaries, especially definitely in the bottom half, the bottom 12 of the league in terms of stopping opposing wide receivers. So I do think if in fact he steps up to the plate, John Brown should have a good week. Here's my number 5. Moving on to number 6, Stefon Diggs. As I see it currently, I think Stefon Diggs at this moment in time will probably get a little bit of coverage from a Marshawn Lattimore, but so will Adam Thielen. They're going to rotate him around. Stefon Diggs has definitely been more of the reliable receiver, considering he's just been present. Health is wealth in the National Football League, and it currently stands as that, especially in this offense. Stefon Diggs has consistently been there. As of right now, he is the go-to receiver for this offense. The tight ends have been very quiet in the last couple of weeks, and I do believe Stefon Diggs is probably going to step up. The last time he played against the Saints in the playoffs, he had the Minnesota Miracle. Maybe he can have another miracle game here. He's my number 6 wide receiver for today. Moving on. Tyler Lockett's my number 7. Again, like I mentioned before with DK Metcalf. They've been inconsistent. Sure, against the Eagles last time, both these guys were quite poor in terms of their production. But again, Tyler Lockett's going to have to step up and get the job done, and I think he'll do it. Alongside DK Metcalf, it offers an extra little bit of opportunity for Tyler Lockett because you're never getting the number 1 wide receiver coverage. You're never being double teamed in the slot. And in my opinion, if Tyler Lockett, it really just needs one play, and he'll get that opportunity, and hopefully he'll act upon it and bring home some fantasy points for fantasy owners this week. He's my number 7 wide receiver ranked. Moving on to Cole Beasley. Again, Cole Beasley, I've mentioned him many times. Cole Beasley finished this season, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see the season total here. Here we go. Season total. Cole Beasley finished, and I quote, as definitely a top 24 wide receiver, right? Where did he go? Let me see here. No, Cole Beasley did not finish the top 24. Did he get shifted out just barely? Yeah, he did. Oh my. Okay, he's a top 30 wide receiver. I thought he was better than that. Maybe I saw some stat from the second half of the season, because in the second half of the season, he's truly been ridiculous. Catching since week 7, he's caught 6 receiving touchdowns. Like, that's pretty ridiculous. 2 games of over 100 receiving yards, a bunch of targets going in his direction, especially against the New England Patriots, putting up 108 receiving yards and 7 receptions on 12 targets. That's pretty promising. But again, the way I see it with Cole Beasley, he is the only other option outside of a Singletary and outside of a John Brown who will produce. And running underneath formations and being able to find and be a safety blanket for Josh Allen, it just adds an extra opportunity for this offense. And I think Cole Beasley will be able to take advantage of that and produce on the week. Moving on. Let's close out the wide receiver position. My number 9 is Julian Edelman. Now, I'm a little worried about Julian Edelman because of the fact that he is injured. It is apparent. He does not play like he did earlier this season. Earlier this season, we saw Julian Edelman, 10-plus targets every single game, 100 receiving yards, or has a touchdown. Feasts every single week. But the thing about Julian Edelman's career is that he's never stayed fully healthy, and that is what is going to bite him in the ass this week and going into the playoffs. His health has caught up to him. He is not fully healthy. We know he's a fantastic wide receiver. He's amazing. He's unbelievable in the playoffs and in the postseason. But unfortunately, Julian Edelman, his journey might be coming short. If he is not healthy and up to par this week, the secondary of the Tennessee Titans, it's not fantastic, but they have pieces. They truly do have pieces. Rowe, Butler, Jackson, they have Bird. They have different pieces that is going to be able to step up potentially and cover him. And if he's not ready to go full speed, it's going to be tough for Edelman. That's why he sits at number 9. Moving on to 10, I hope Adam Thielen shows up. I truly do. I think it'll be. I'm hoping he does for his mental sake. The last couple of weeks he saw 3 targets, 0 receptions in week 16, and that's brutal. Right? But this offense truly does need him. They need that second offensive weapon down the field. This is a guy that, without a doubt, has been one of the better wide receivers in the National Football League over the last 2 seasons, but health has been a huge concern of his, and that's why he sits at number 10, because I don't know what kind of Adam Thielen we're going to see out there. I'm hoping to at least see the Saints take a early lead, and a guy like Kirk Cousins have to throw the ball for majority of the second half and feed his guys like a Stefon Diggs and an Adam Thielen in order to get back in the game. And hopefully Adam Thielen can show up and show out. Moving on. Number 11, Will Fuller was limited to practice today. But I do think if Will Fuller is going to give it a shot, he could end up becoming a pretty big offensive piece. When Tre'Davious White is on the other side of the field covering heavily on DeAndre Hopkins, it's going to force a guy like Deshaun Watson to look elsewhere and to feed another wide receiver. If Will Fuller is healthy and ready to go, I think he's a huge play. If Will Fuller is not going, I would just switch Kenny Stills into this spot, forewarning. Okay, moving on. Greg Ward Jr., again, another one of these guys that in the last couple of weeks, he is the only wide receiver that I trust on the Philadelphia Eagles, and it's not even close. I think Greg Ward, as the weeks have progressed, he's gotten a pretty good target count, 9, 9, 5, and 7. Those are pretty good target counts. Obviously, his receiving yards could be better. Everything could be better, but he's doing his best out there. He's trying to be the number 1 wide receiver with very little experience, being an undrafted free agent rookie. This is unexperienced territory that he's walking into. It's going to be tough for him, but they'll be at home at least, and I think if Carson Wentz can at least air it out to him a little bit, he could have a pretty good week. Moving on to N'Keal Harry is my number 13. I think in comparison to him or Mohamed Sanu, N'Keal Harry has been given more opportunity. He is the number 1 on the outside, and I think he could end up becoming more and more of this offense, considering Edelman's shortcomings in terms of not being on the field as long and not seeing as many targets or being healthy enough to field said targets. I think N'Keal Harry could be a big product of this game and potentially catch himself a touchdown as a red zone threat. N'Keal Harry sits at my number 13. Corey Davis is my number 14. On the other side of that offense, we have the Tennessee offense. And we look at it and we think, again, if Stephon Gilmore is going to be covering a guy like A.J. Brown and they'll have a McCourty over the top double covering him, another wide receiver or receiving option needs to step up, whether it's Jonnu Smith or Corey Davis. Davis, in my opinion, is the next guy up. Maybe Tajay Sharp could end up stepping up. But again, if Corey Davis is healthy and ready to go, he's the number 2 on that team. And he's my number 14 in my rankings. Kenny Stills, again, like I talked about with Will Fuller, if Will Fuller's gone, Kenny Stills would step up. But even if, I think Kenny Stills is another one of these good options. If the running game falls out from underneath them, or in fact, the Houston Texans do not take an early lead and are down for majority of the game like they are in many of their contests, we could see them try to air it out late in the game, and Kenny Stills could be a guy in the slot position that could step up. Moving on to the last wide receiver, I wanted to bring up Tre'Quon Smith because Tre'Quon is a very interesting, in my opinion, fantasy prospect. I got to find his stat because it's interesting what he's done in the last couple weeks. Since week 10, because Tre'Quon Smith missed an injury from weeks 3 through 9, okay? Since week 10, he came back, and from weeks 12 through 17, scored 4 touchdowns in those 6 games. Now, many of his stat lines look similar. 1 catch, 21 yards, touchdown. 2 catch, 29 yards, touchdown. 1 catch, 13 yards, and a touchdown. There are always these numbers that we consistently see where he's catching only 1 or 2 passes. Obviously, this last week in week 17, had himself a better week, 5 catches, 56 yards, and a touchdown. That's more promising. But again, we have to understand that as the weeks progress, this is a guy that down in the red zone is one of Drew Brees' favorite targets to throw the ball to. Every time Drew Brees wants to break a record, he finds Tre'Quon Smith. And again, could be not a bad fantasy option because of touchdown upside. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about quarterbacks. All right, so Drew Brees, again, is, in my opinion, the number one quarterback on the week playing against the Minnesota Vikings. This guy's been absolutely incredible for the last couple of weeks. Again, this guy's throwing 3+ touchdowns in almost every single game. And it's pretty surprising considering last year, Drew Brees really wasn't in this kind of I'm coming after you and I'm scoring every single time I have an opportunity, because the offense was a little different. The offense was more predicated on running the ball and being able to just kill clock and play defense. But in the last, 8 weeks of the season, when he's come back and he's been healthy, I'm telling you, outside of playing the Atlanta Falcons, no one else has been able to stop a guy like Drew Brees. They have not even come close to stopping him. 3+ touchdown passes in every single game except for the 2 against the Atlanta Falcons. And they're not playing the Atlanta Falcons this week, are they? They're playing against the Minnesota Vikings. Therefore, I do expect Drew Brees again to be the number one quarterback this week. Moving on to number 2, Russell Wilson. The matchup is fantastic. Russell Wilson got back to being Russell Wilson last week. I had mentioned it many times. Russell Wilson in the first 9 games of the season, was a different quarterback than what he was in the second half. He was throwing interceptions. He wasn't throwing, more than 2 touchdowns in a single game. In fact, he was throwing 1 touchdown games. But the ability, yes, to at least get them into the fourth quarter and give them an opportunity to potentially win that game last week, that showed me a little bit of extra oomph from Russell Wilson that we saw earlier in the season. Sure, he kind of fell apart late in the game. A lot of incompletions, a lot of mistakes from the wide receivers, but they'll patch that up. And against a lesser team like the Eagles, I think he'll be a better play. He's my number 2. Moving on to number 3, Ryan Tannehill. Again, I'm fully on board with this Tennessee Titans are beating the Patriots thing. And as it currently stands, Ryan Tannehill is a lot of that offense. And he's the key to making sure that absolutely goes through. Just looking at what Ryan Tannehill has produced this season, again, I will mention it again. For the last, since week 7, he's had 2+ touchdowns in every single game. Every single game since week 7. 10 weeks straight. It has not stopped. And I don't think it's stopping here in week 18. Ryan Tannehill is my number 3 quarterback on the week. Again, I think they're ready to go. And I think as long as Derrick Henry's out there setting up the play action, Ryan Tannehill is going to be able to take advantage of that and produce as well as he possibly can. He's my number 3. Moving on to number 4, Josh Allen. I think Josh Allen, again, is one of these underrated quarterbacks. All season long, even before the season began, he was an underrated quarterback because no one really knew what to expect, because we saw him be the turnover machine that he was all of last season. And he's kind of not been that all season long. He's truly improved leaps and bounds. Only 9 interceptions comparatively. I know he fumbles a lot, but comparatively to the year before, this guy's been great. Playing against New England at New England was the biggest thing that kind of leaned me towards this idea that they can go ahead and take out a team like the Texans, or at least produce well enough. When you go into New England, you still throw 2 touchdown passes. When you're throwing, a 50% completion percentage, all you have to do is tighten that up. And how do you tighten that up? You play against a lesser secondary. And I truly do believe Josh Allen, his running ability, his ability to sit in the pocket, and find his favorite receivers and still be fantasy relevant against tough matchups. Again, in the second half of the season, New England, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Dallas, Denver, those are not easy defenses, and was pretty consistent in every single one of those games. Had 18+ fantasy points in 4 of those 5 matchups in a 6-point per passing touchdown format. Again, Josh Allen's my number 4. Moving on to number 5, Deshaun Watson. I think Deshaun Watson, again, another one of these guys you can't count out. Even when he's having a lesser game, he's still going to have that 2 touchdown minimum, whether it's through the air or on the ground. He'll get there. And I think Deshaun Watson, that's where his value will lie. He is a guy that wants to come back in games and eventually take the lead back from his, the opposing team and try to, storm a comeback. He'll probably end up doing that, but it'll fall short in my opinion. He'll still be a pretty decent play. He's my number 5. Number 6 is Tom Brady. I think Tom Brady will, everything's on the line for Tom Brady. It really is. Like, a lot of people see this game and think, no, it's going to be fun. There is a lot on the line here. This is a huge step for this offense. If they can step up and win this game, it says, and it speaks loudly about what Tom Brady can potentially do. He has nobody surrounding him. A lot of playmakers are gone. And to be honest, if he can step up and produce against this team, then that'd be fantastic. But again, he has struggled in the last couple weeks, or for the last 6-7 weeks, to just about anybody, and it's been tough to watch. But again, I think he could potentially have himself a better week than the other two quarterbacks. My number 7 is Kirk Cousins. I don't know about Kirk Cousins, man. He's really fallen off the wagon in the last couple weeks, and that kind of concerns me. If this offense doesn't get off to a hot start, they could end up seeing Kirk Cousins drown in the second half and potentially not really have too much of a presence. In the last 3 weeks, in which he started against Green Bay, the Chargers, and against Detroit. Only one passing touchdown in each of those 3 games. Even in games, I mean, they're winning heavily against Detroit and had a pretty good passing completion percentage, 24 for 30, 242 yards, and a touchdown. Not getting those extra touchdowns, not having those 4 touchdown games, at least 2 touchdown games, that kind of leads me away from you. That's why I have Kirk Cousins 7. And the last quarterback I have here is Carson Wentz, with the potential of Zach Ertz not playing once again, and the Miles Sanders gone, Brandon Graham, the right guard, gone for the season. They're working with very little playmakers and or offensive help. Carson Wentz is going to be up against it, and I don't think he's going to be able to step up. I hope he does. For his sake, I think it would be nice to see Carson Wentz pick up a playoff win, especially in this current manner, with how brutalized this offense or team has been in terms of injury. But I don't see it really happening. He's my number 8. Let's go ahead and close out today's video. Let's talk about some tight ends. Starting off with number 1, Zach Ertz. Again, if Zach Ertz is to play, he would be the number 1 tight end on the week, in my opinion. The guy would see a bunch of targets. The offense is using tight ends. 90% of offensive snaps are played by tight ends. And we have to understand that's 2 tight end plus. I mean, when Goedert and Zach Ertz have been healthy in the back end of the season, Zach Ertz is playing like 90% of snaps while Goedert plays like 85. They're both on the field. They're both producing. They're both seeing targets. If, in fact, Zach Ertz is healthy and ready to go, which I'm hoping that's the case, it will help Carson Wentz a lot. But, again, we have to understand in terms of the tight end position, there aren't much, playmakers or talent pieces here. Therefore, again, Zach Ertz is the stud amongst them. He's my number 1. Moving on to number 2, Jared Cook. In terms of consistency, Jared Cook has been that all season long, and it's never slowed down. I'm telling you, Jared Cook is really producing at an extremely alarming rate. I mean, we knew he was good last year, but when this season started this year, his usage was down in the gutter. But as soon as week 5 showed up and him and Teddy Bridgewater got some momentum there, and in week 6, they scored again in the red zone. He got injured. They came back after the week 9 bye. And from week 10 through week 17, the dude he's had a 10-plus point performance in every single week except for one. From weeks 10 through 17, the only game in which he didn't have a 10-point performance was against Indianapolis. Still had 4 receptions for 54 yards. Didn't have that touchdown. But in the last couple weeks, again, he's had 7 receiving touchdowns. Like, this is unbelievable. And down in the red zone, this is where this guy's finding value. And I think he's going to continue to be a stud. He's my number 2 on the week. Moving on to number 3, Dallas Goedert. Again, like I mentioned before, the Eagles are using tight ends at a premium because that's how this offense is built. And when you want to, replace wide receivers who have gone down with injury, running backs that have gone down with injury, you have to bring in tight ends that are going to help out Carson Wentz. That's exactly what Dallas Goedert presents. And especially if, in fact, Zach Ertz is to go down with an injury in this game, Dallas Goedert could be, or, if Zach Ertz doesn't even play, Dallas Goedert steps up as the number 1, could be of great service. He's my number 3 tight end on the week. Jacob Hollister is my number 4. Hollister's usage, his trust in the red zone. I mean, a couple passes placed better. I mean, if when they ran that little pick route wheel down the sideline in the red zone, if Hollister, if at least Russell Wilson isn't under pressure, can deliver the ball cleanly, Hollister has a touchdown there and he wins the week. But again, the target counts for Hollister haven't been bad in the last 5 weeks. 8, 6, 3, 6, 8. Pretty consistent. I mean, he's sitting in a pretty good range. They play against the Philadelphia Eagles, a defense that at times, in my opinion, they've given up some points, but they're pretty good against tight ends. They're no joke. This is a better defense, even though their secondary in terms of playing against wide receivers at times have been very weak. They even proved last week against Daniel Jones, who was an absolute mess for a majority of that game, that they could produce. And they give up the 5th fewest points to opposing tight ends this season. Last week, Caden Smith had 8 for 98, which is pretty consistent. But outside of that, everybody's scoring like 2 to 5 points against them. We had a big week from Mike Gesicki, 5 for 79 and a touchdown. But outside of that, again, this is an offense or defense that hasn't really given up much to opposing tight ends, and that's why I'm a little concerned for Hollister. But comparatively to the other guys, he gets the nod. Moving on to Jonnu Smith. Again, Jonnu Smith is stepping up in the absence of any other receiving option in this offense. He's been consistent, and he's seen targets and has become one of the main contributors in this offense, even running the ball out of the backfield when they need to give Derrick Henry a break. Jonnu Smith will come in and run a toss play and make the most of it. So as of right now, he's being used in the formation as a blocker mainly, but will always leak out for the tight end, play action plays. Obviously, the Patriots are pretty good against the tight end position, but again, comparatively to the other guys, Jonnu Smith gets the nod. Darren Fells, when we're talking about defenses giving up the least amount of points to tight ends, it's the Buffalo Bills. Darren Fells is a touchdown fiend in the red zone and has been that this season, but I'm a little concerned about his potential if, in fact, this defense locks him down and ends up forcing Deshaun Watson to find another target to throw the ball to. Moving on, Kyle Rudolph. Again, Kyle Rudolph will always have the opportunity and or ability to be a upside touchdown guy down in the red zone, but it's concerning if, in fact, he doesn't get the job done there. We could end up seeing Kyle Rudolph be a little bit of an underwhelming play. The last guy I wanted to mention is Taysom Hill. Now, there are some DFS, I think DraftKings has it where Taysom Hill can be used as a tight end rather than a quarterback. If that's the case, this is a guy that has scored consistently for this offense, and he's been vulturing touchdowns almost all season long, which is kind of upsetting. But again, this last week had himself a touchdown against Indianapolis, had himself a touchdown against Atlanta, had himself a touch. Like 3 of the last 5 weeks, he's been consistently getting some work there. Doesn't really do much in the passing game. He's more of a receiving tight end kind of athlete. That's what he is. He's just an athlete. He hasn't really been the quarterback that runs around, but he's been a special teams contributor and a guy that could potentially be played at the tight end position if the format or website allows it. Anyway, those are the rankings for this week. Thank you everybody for watching. We'll have, depending on how this video goes in terms of views, stuff like that, maybe we'll have another one for next week for those of you interested. But again, we'll talk about DFS pricing and stuff like that later on this week on the podcast. Every Point Counts podcast. For those of you who haven't checked that out, go check that out. Talking about the NFL playoffs. But again, thank you everybody for watching. Happy New Year. Hope everyone's doing well. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.